Thank you. I would like to thank the organization of the event for the opportunity to be part of the 5th Garrett International Conference, my colleague speakers, and all participants. I will try to quickly present you today a little bit of the story of the Arquivo Histórico Wanda Svevo, the historical archive from the Biennale de São Paulo. As said by Raul Antelo, the Biennale for many inhabitants of São Paulo is located in Ibirapuera Park, but the Biennale is not a place, nor is found in space. It is a history and is understood as a process. During this process, the biennial has faced many crises, but had always the ability to reinvent itself, reborn from ashes each time. And the records of this process are kept in the Arquivos Históricos. The first 6 editions of the biennial were organized by the São Paulo Museum of Modern Art, the Museu de Arte Moderna de São Paulo, created in 1948 by the industrialist Francisco Matarazzo Sobrinho, known as Ciccillo. Together with the museum's directors, Ciccillo and his wife, Yolanda Penteado, have managed to implement the Venice Biennale model in São Paulo, establishing the city at the center of the world's artistic scene. The first biennial de São Paulo was realized in 1951, ending up as a great success, mix of improvisation and boldness. The second biennial was bigger than the first one and would be remembered as the Guernica's Biennial. The exhibition would be extended until 1954, celebrating the 4th centenary of the city and realized at the newly opened Ibirapuera Park. In 1955, between the second and the third biennials, Wanda Svevo, General Secretary of the museum, started to collect and organize reference material on artists and art in general to give support for the biennials and researchers. She has brought also the Venice Biennial model for the archive, running the documentation process of the exhibitions while acting as Ciccillo's right hand in public relations. Wanda sent letters to artists all around the world with information forms to be filled and mailed back to the archives, including any reference material of their work, such as biographies, catalogs, folders, posters, or photographs. The initiative was unprecedented in the context of museums and art archives in America. Until 1959, texts about the archive's work were successively published in local newspapers and highlighted its role of support for educational activities of the museum. On the other hand, the museum is criticized for its administrative discontinuity and for not providing enough resources to maintain the organization of the Arquivos Históricos. Sorry. In 1962, 2 moments of rupture prevail over the museum. After repeated crises within the museum board and the growth of the biennials, Ciccillo creates the Fundação Bienal de São Paulo in order to separate the exhibition's organization from the museum. The art collection is donated to University of São Paulo, giving rise to the creation of the Museum of Contemporary Art. The archives remain with the Fundação Bienal, including part of the museum administrative documentation, and its employees were transferred to the Fundação. In November of the same year, Wanda Svevo died in an airplane crash when traveling to Peru to work on an exhibition for the 7th biennial. A few months later, in her memory, the archives became Arquivos Históricos Wanda Svevo. The institutional crisis and discontinued policies reflected directly on the archive's neglection during the following years, while the administrative records were kept in a separate room known as the Dead Archive. Those times coincide with the beginning of the dictatorship period in Brazil. The repression and censorship of the regime directly reflected on the following exhibitions. Added to successive internal conflicts, they increased the crisis in the institution. In 1966, Maria Bonomi and other artists manifest their concerns about the biennial's organization in a public document, referring also to the archives and criticizing the low investments designated by the foundation to organize and update it. In 1967, public manifestations against the military regime, together with the interventional aspect of the new art presented at the exhibition, became the highlights of the 9th biennial, known as the Pop Biennial. Cibele Varela's and Kisak Jr.'s work were removed from the exhibition, considered offensive to the government. The last one because of the use of the Brazilian flag. Ironically, Jasper Jones' work, Three Flags, was awarded in that edition. After demonstration of censorship practices during art exhibitions in Bahia and Rio de Janeiro, Claudia told us about it, an international movement culminates in the boycott of the 10th biennial. Artists from USA, Mexico, France, Sweden, Argentina, Netherlands, and many from Brazil have refused to participate. After the boycott, the Bienal de São Paulo goes through a period of less prestige among many critics, but also attempts on and movements towards changing the existing model. Under the pressure of critics and artists, the Biennale promoted between 1969 and 1971 a series of meetings with the aim of discussing changes in the exhibition. However, it seems that the purposes of the archives were still not completely understood. It wasn't until the 80s that new approaches would be taken concerned the archives and preservation of institutional memory. In 1984, alongside the redemocratization of the country, the Dead Archive started to be organized. After being stored in the closet room for almost 20 years under totally inadequate conditions. In 1986, an exhibition project was presented by the archives researcher, emphasizing that the objective was to ensure that the biennial abandoned for once the attitude of contempt over the Arquivos Históricos and assumed it as a precious collection that it is. This project would be put into practice only a few years later. After 4 years' work, part of the documents of the first biennials had been catalogued, and the Arquivo brought for the first time to the public a series of important records about the biennial history. A special exhibition of selected documents took place during the 20th biennial. From this point on, this documentation becomes an essential source for the research of the biennials and art history, including the Brazilian cultural, diplomatic, political, and artistic context linked to them. During the year 2000, other preservation projects were implemented, including informatization efforts to make collections data available to the public. Since 2014, an inventory of the whole collection is being carried out. As from the 27th biennial, in 2006, the archive started to play an active role in the exhibition, becoming a focus of artists' work and curatorial discussions. Artists appropriate the archives for the constructions of their projects, giving them new meanings, transforming their narratives, or bringing their stories to light. With the project Museumuseu, artist Mabe Bethônico, assuming that the archive was little known by the general public, developed advertising campaign using posters seeking to inform about the archive's constitution and location, taking a mediator role between the public and the archives. The different types of documents and their place in the archives were outlined in the exhibition space, pointing out the untouchable or in-transit ones, activating the public curiosity. Additionally, frequent asked questions received by the archives and collected during the event were listed on the walls to stress the public expectations in relation to the archives and the Biennale itself. 2 years later, in 2008, facing financial problems, the 28th Biennial, curated by Ivo Mesquita, invited to an extensive net of discussions and reflection on both the history of Biennial's model and its future. One of the main purposes of the exhibition was to bring attention to the Arquivo Histórico Wanda Svevo and the Fundação Biennale's memory. According to Mesquita, the occupation of the third floor of the Biennale Pavilion sought to activate this history, always open to new readings and interpretations. In order to show visitors how much information was represented by more than 200 biennials, the archive embarked on a campaign to collect catalogs of the largest possible number of biennial exhibitions all around the world. The library Biennials of the World was exhibited during the 28th Biennial and then taken to the Bergen Biennial Conference in the next year. The 28th Biennial's catalog was published in the format of a weekly newspaper where artist Mabe Bethônico again also made a contribution. As she said, we tried getting to know the Wanda Svevo persona from her writings, both by hand and typed. We saw the day-to-day routine of the production behind some biennials. At the 31st Biennial in 2014, a selection of duplicates of books and catalogs from the archives collections composed an auditorium library designed by the curatorial team, on which the artist Erick Beltrán composed an intervention. When opening any of the books in the library, the public would find loose pages featuring hand drawings and illustrations related to the theme of the double in many expressions. In 2013, an exhibition celebrating the biennial's 6th birthday was developed around the historical context, the 30 times biennial. At the same time, the Arquivos Históricos were actively publishing on the institutional website, bringing life to the stories found in the collection documents. More than 100 posts showing curiosities, studies, and behind the scenes are now linked to the exhibition's profile online. With the proposal of making its historical contents accessible, last July, the Bienal de São Paulo launched a new area of its website dedicated to the memory of its 32 biennial exhibitions. The platform combines texts, historical photos, virtual visits, exhibition plans, publications, posters, and other contents of the exhibitions made available by the archives. In the end, the archive is fulfilling its mission to keep those records, memories, and stories alive in a continuous two-way process, contributing for the knowledge about art, production of knowledge about art and culture in the 20th and 21st century by turning new contents into new sources, as it incorporates the outcomes of the researchers developed in its collections. These publications then become new sources for work for the institution itself and others. You may know some of them. Thank you. I try to be quick.